Welcome to the 55th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I host the New Ventures podcast to help people starting climate initiatives learn from others who are already progressed in these paths. Our guest for today is Dr Md Golam Rabbani, the head of the Climate Bridge Fund Secretariat in BRAC, Bangladesh. The Climate Bridge Fund is a financing mechanism to fund small-scale projects to strengthen the resilience of climate migrants in Bangladesh. Welcome, Rabbani.
Thank you so much.
Rabbani, let's start by getting a picture of the overall geography and the types of impacts of climate change. In the Bridge Fund, you're focusing on a few regions. Just take our audience through a tour of the region as if they were traveling through Bangladesh.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sanjay. Let me start with a very interesting story that I experienced in 2013 in the coastal zone of Bangladesh. In Satkhira, there is a Union Parishad. It's just lowest administrative unit in Bangladesh. It's called Gabura. And I met a farmer whose name was Abdul Karim. And in 2013, when I met him, and he explained how he had to experience the climate-induced cyclonic event, Cyclone Aila, that affected his family and his surroundings in 2009 in May. And immediately after this Cyclone Aila in Satkhira, he had to move to Rangamati, which is a hill tract district in Bangladesh, which is approximately more than 500 kilometers away from the coastal zone in Satkhira. So what he did immediately after the cyclonic event, he moved to Rangamati and he tried to stay there in Rangamati with his family, his kids. But after 2 years, he realized that what he learned living in Satkhira, how to cultivate rice and vegetables in Satkhira, was not really consistent with the cultivation methods and the process in Rangamati. And after 2 years, he came back to Satkhira and then started cultivating again. But it was very unfortunate, and he was explaining by saying that, you see, I just planted the rice and I prepared my seed bed, and the rice plant was less than 6 inches. But there was a heavy rainfall during August in 2013. And this rainfall, extreme rainfall in short period of time, actually devastatingly affected his rice plant. And now he was asking me, in 2009, I was affected, my family was affected by cyclone and storm surge. And when I came back after 2 years, in 2011, and then I again faced this extreme rainfall. You see how the coastal zone in Bangladesh is getting affected by climate-induced hazards in almost every year in the country. Now, my question to you, and he was asking me question, if we face these extreme events almost every year, how could we stay in this particular region in Bangladesh, and where to go, how to go? I tried my best for last 2 years, but I could not survive. And I was asking him why he could not survive there. And he was saying, you see, last 40, 50 years, I learned, how to sustain my life here, how to continue my livelihood here. And the livelihood pattern in the coastal zone and the livelihood pattern in the hill tracts district is just 200 kilometers away is not same. It's completely different. So I can move to some places, my ecosystems, my learning really do not move one place to another. So this is how the climate change induced hazard affecting this coastal zone and the hilly areas in Bangladesh.
I think this is very interesting, Rabbani. And we all know that Bangladesh is very vulnerable to climate disasters. But I also want to remind my audience that Bangladesh is actually a very small country. Just to put the statistics together very clearly. From one part of Bangladesh to another, north, south, east, west, whichever way we go, is probably somewhere in the region of 600 to 800 kilometers. But even within this small country, Rabbani, there are various types of climate disasters, right? The coastal areas face a certain type, and you've so vividly described it. But for example, the northern part, and I know you are there in the Rajshahi district, do they face different types of climate hazards?
Sanjay, this is a very interesting question. To respond to your question, the straight answer is yes. I just explained how the climate-induced different hazards that includes cyclone storm surge and salinity intrusion and temperature variation, rainfall variation affect the coastal zone in different ways. And northern part of the country, which includes Rajshahi, Rangpur in Bangladesh, they suffer from other type of climate-related hazards. That includes the number one is drought condition, number two is flood, number three is riverbank erosion, number four is raised temperature. So these are the different type of climate-related hazards that actually affect the northern part of the country. To give you one example, if you consider the education in southern part of the country, cyclonic events damage the infrastructure that also includes schools and other academic institutions, which means like many children cannot really go to school for even about a year. I give you a straight example. After Cyclone Aila in 2009, many children in Koira sub-district of Khulna district could not go to school for about a year. So this is a southern part of the country. But if you go to the northern part, I was actually talking to some of the school teachers and the children in Rajshahi specifically, and they were complaining that in pre-monsoon, particularly during March, April, May, our students cannot come to the school. And more specifically, many of the female children cannot come to the school even during their exam. I was asking them why, and they were saying, you see, there are problems that they face during their menstruation cycle, and the temperature really compelled them to stay at home during raised temperature when this Rajshahi experienced more than 40 degrees centigrade temperature. So these are the different type of implications that you see, even if you consider only on education. So one thing, the infrastructure damage, and the other thing is the dropout of the children and the absence of the children in the school.
Right. And dropping out of children in school means, as people say in climate terminology, the reduction of adaptive capacity over a longer period of time. I want to understand a little bit of why are people migrating, and is the migration increasing? And the reason I'm asking this is that anybody who has been to Dhaka, and I would encourage my audience to go there, knows that people have been migrating to Dhaka for years, for decades. It is really a very densely populated city. Are you saying that because of climate migration, people are migrating more? And the example that you gave seems to indicate that a person is migrating not just from the rural area to the urban area, but they're also migrating between various rural areas. So help us understand this a little bit.
Let me just give you a few examples. I was talking to the city mayor of Shatkhira and Mr. Taskin Ahmed. I can give his name. Immediately after Cyclone Amphan in 2020, I met him with some of my team members from CVF Secretariat, and he was explaining by saying that at least 60,000 people came from different rural areas to the city corporation areas and Purushabha areas of Shatkhira because of the Cyclone Amphan. So that's one example. But if you consider the different studies of the government and also the non-government sector research institutions, one example that I could share right now is, according to the Ministry of Disaster Management of the government of Bangladesh, it says 1 in every 7 people will be migrated due to climate change by 2050, while this projection in the global aspect is 1 in every 45 people. So you can imagine how these people in Bangladesh is actually getting displaced due to different type of climatic hazards.
I understand studies and projection, and to a certain extent, the reason why, at least I personally feel a little uncomfortable in having a discussion on these projections is because they could take the worst climate scenarios. What would be very interesting is the data that you are seeing. To me, what was very interesting is the 60,000 people already migrating to a city area because of extreme events, right? And it seems to me that people are moving between areas of Bangladesh as well, right?
Yes, you have to consider it different episode, like immediately after the event, and 3 months after the event, 6 months after the event. What happens is when there is a cyclone signal, many people are placed in the cyclone shelter, but some people immediately move to the city and Purushabha. What happens is those people who are living, very close to the rivers, and they experience the worst damage of their housing, their lands, their properties, their assets. So they don't find any other alternative options rather than moving from that origin to a nearest destination. And when I say nearest destination, it is the sub-district or district level. So when they come to this district level or sub-district level location, some of them stay there for about a month, and they go back when their origin becomes a bit stable. They just go back. But many people, for example, that city mayor Taskina Ahmed was saying 60,000 people came here immediately after the cyclonic event in 2020. But within 3 to 6 months, half of them already left. But what happened is 30,000 people continued living there because they fear to go their origin back and experience those devastating events anymore in near future. So that's the scenario that happens. But again, to elaborate further, from these 30,000 people in Shatkhira, they try to connect with their relatives, their friends in capital city like Dhaka, in larger city like Khulna, and they further move to those Khulna and city again. So this is the regular part of their life that you see that happens because of these climatic events.
And obviously, people move in anticipation of extreme events like floods and cyclones. People are also moving because, agricultural productivity is falling, livestock productivity is falling, it is becoming harder to work in the fields, the soils are becoming saline, or what we in climate terms call chronic events.
Yeah, absolutely. You are right. When I used to talk to some of the farmers and some of the fishermen, they specifically mentioned that just 10, 15 years back, I used to get like 2 to 3 tons per hectare of this land here. But unfortunately, it has gone half nowadays because of saline nutrition, because of a shifting of rainfall, because of lack of surface water, fresh water for irrigation. So these are the reasons that they used to explain often and often. When I talk to the fishermen, they often say in this river, just 10, 15 years back, we used to get like more than 15 kilos of fishes almost every day. And it came down to 4 to 5 kilos. And to some extent, even less than that. I was asking further question whether the number of fishermen has increased and you get less fishes in this river. And then they responded by saying, no, this is not the case. The number of fishermen did not increase, rather it has gone down because the many people has left these areas in last 5-10 years. And now we cannot really catch the fishes from these rivers, these canals, like the amount that we got just 15 years back or 10 years back. So these are the reasons that they are also facing to find alternative options, for example, migration to nearest destination. And if you ask them with additional question, how this happens, and they raise their last point by saying that salinity has increased in these rivers if you compare 15, 10, 20 years back. So that's one of the reasons. And the second thing is those other climate-related elements, the temperature rise and the shifting of rainfall, the amount of rainfall, they frequently explain their factors, like the amount of rainfall we used to get in June, now we get the same amount of rainfall in July. And the amount of rainfall that we used to get in July, now it comes in August. And the amount of rainfall that we used to get in August, it comes now in September. So there is a shifting of rainfall. So they have to change the pattern of agricultural practices in those areas. So if you combine all these factors they are facing and they are explaining, these are the major factors that actually affect our life and livelihood as a whole. And these are the reasons why we are also considering moving from this origin to other destination.
Yeah. And obviously, what you're saying is that rainfall patterns have changed. If it just changed by a month, people could have adapted. But what you haven't said, but we all know, is that it's not just that rain that falls in June now falls in July. It is that it's much more unpredictable. It could fall in July. Everything could fall in one intense burst and so on and so forth. So before we start moving to the discussing the financing facility, I want to summarize this context. Bangladesh is a small country. But even in this small country, given its geography, Bangladesh faces multiple climate hazards. There is extreme events such as cyclones in the coastal part, and there is river erosion and increased temperatures all across the country. People migrate because when they lose their houses during a cyclone. I do have to remind people that Bangladesh in 50 years has moved from a least developed country to a middle income country. So Bangladesh's early warning systems means that the number of deaths from cyclones has reduced remarkably this period. But people do lose property and they move and then they're afraid to come back. But they also move because of the story that you're saying of fishermen losing their livelihoods because the number of fish is much less today, or maybe the size of the fish is much less today. They move because the soil is becoming saline. What I want to say is that people don't move because they want to. These people are rooted to the ground. They've been there for generations, and they know how to live a particular livelihood. They are losing this livelihood, and they're not necessarily equipped, as the story that you said very vividly in response to my first question. They are not equipped necessarily to explore other livelihoods. So with this context, we will move into the financing facility that you manage and ask you to introduce that facility.
Wonderful. Let me just start by saying that this Climate Bridge Fund was established by BRAC with support from the government of Germany, KfW, and our official journey started in November 2019. And the objective of this facility was to support this special group of people, more specific, the climate migrants or people who are at the risk of being displaced from any destination. So based on the experiences of BRAC across the country, they wanted to focus on supporting or providing adaptation support to these special people in 5 priority destination in Bangladesh. Some of these locations are from the south, the coastal zone, and some of these locations are from the north, from the Rajshahi zone. So drought-prone ecosystem and coastal ecosystem. So if we just elaborate on the financial resources, let me just share with you that Climate Bridge Fund has 2 windows. One is climate change window, and the second one is emergency response window. And under the climate change window, German government has supported 11.735 million euro, and BRAC has supported 0.2 million euro, which means in total we have 11.9375 million euro to support climate change adaptation projects in these 5 priority locations. And under emergency response window, we have 10 million euro, and we started in 2021, and we are supporting 14 projects to the people who are very vulnerable and who have to experience severe consequences of the COVID-19 and also the climate-related disasters. So this is in brief, I could speak on the funding facility.
I have one specific question, obviously, and I think we should hear a little bit about BRAC. Obviously, it's the world's largest NGO.
As you know, BRAC has started their work in Bangladesh since its liberation. Okay, immediately after the liberation, BRAC started their work from the northeast part of the country, and currently it is operating in Bangladesh. Just in brief, it has about 18 large programs in the country to support, for example, health, livelihood, water supply sanitation, climate change, disaster, humanitarian aspects. So these are the different type of large scale programs that is being operated across the country, almost every district in Bangladesh. So currently we have approximately 70,000 people working in this organization. And with this large scale support, we see that the microfinance program is one of the largest program that is supporting entire country in Bangladesh, in addition to other 11 countries. So I think that gives you a brief about BRAC.
Yes, it does. And I think in our podcast today, we'll actually talk much more about the Climate Bridge Fund. So first question for you is, tell us a little bit, Rabbani, about how you fund projects. What's the process like?
Thank you. Well, in brief, we have two stages call for proposal. The first stage is very brief. We advertise the interested candidates to submit their project ideas, which is like 7 to 10 pages project idea, and they will submit it. And then immediately after the deadline, CBF Secretariat evaluate this concept note based on the criteria. We have two types of criteria, project criteria and the institutional criteria. So based on those criteria, we identify and shortlist the project ideas. Those who meet all these criteria, and we see the ideas are very much consistent to our objective and aligned with one of the three categories of our project. The first category, whether the project is an innovative project idea. The second option is whether it is based on a successful pilot case. And the third category is whether in many cases we see that the government-supported project, NGO-supported projects was ended in 2019, but some of the project services discontinued because of some difficulties. So we encourage the NGOs and the interested organization who can bring those services which are discontinued and submit it to us if you see it is feasible, and the short-term project can be sustainable for long-term with some of the financial support from CBF. We can support that project as well. So based on that shortlisted project concept, we request them to submit a detailed proposal, and that is the second stage. So we again have a deadline for submitting a detailed project proposal, and CBF Secretariat start reviewing those detailed proposal based on the given criteria. And we have set of criteria to review those detailed proposal. And after those review and evaluation, we submit it to the result to the advisory committee of the Climate Bridge Fund. We have a very strong advisory committee, which is currently being chaired by Hasin Jahan, who is country director of water in Bangladesh, and vice chair is Dr. Salimul Haq. And we have very strong this technical advisory committee, and they review those proposals and our evaluation results and recommend the best project to KFW and the trustee board. And we also submit our evaluation result and the recommendation from SCCF to KFW for their feedback. And once we get the feedback from KFW and also from the technical committee, and then we present it before the trustee board. This is the highest body to make the final decision regarding selection of the project. And the trustee board listens to us and also look at the recommendation from both technical committee and also KFW, and then they select the final projects. So this is how we actually select the projects under the CBF umbrella.
One thing that I'm getting concerned listening to you is that this process seems to be a while very, very careful process, which is what it should be, but the process seems to be also long, right? And there is an urgency in many of these cases. How do you manage the urgency? How long does this whole process take?
No, procedurally, we take 6 months from submission to first disbursement under the climate change window.
Yeah, 6 months seems to be, fairly reasonable in my opinion. And I think that's probably the benefit of a fund being run by BRAC, which is a national organization, as opposed to similar projects being run by the multilateral funds, where it is not 6 months, but 6 years sometimes for these projects to get financed. There are projects that are done by local NGOs, but there are also projects that I know BRAC implements directly. Can you explain to us, what type of projects does BRAC implement directly and what it expects to get out of that process?
Well, let me just give you some examples on the type of projects that BRAC is currently implementing. One of the projects that is currently being implemented by BRAC is on climate diseases. This is one of the major concern and the priority of forest and climate change in Bangladesh. In fact, in the third national communication, they identify health is one of the third priority area that Bangladesh should plan for adaptation. So what they did, in fact, currently the entire country is experiencing dengue incidences, which is one of the major climate sensitive disease that is being identified by IPCC's sixth assessment report. They are implementing projects since 2020, and they are actually having conversation with the people living in the slums about different type of climate sensitive diseases and different health disorders and how to avoid this dengue, this malaria, this cholera, this chikungunya and kalajor. So these are the major climate sensitive diseases. So they provide some of the health commodities, for example, mosquito nets and also soaps and umbrellas, so that they use both the rainfall and also during the high temperature to avoid the direct consequences. So these are the options that the health program of BRAC is implementing to avoid the climate sensitive diseases and improve their awareness and capacities to deal with the heat stroke, cold stroke, and other communicable diseases that I just mentioned, both waterborne and vector-borne diseases. So that's one type of project. And they're also collecting the data on the climate-sensitive disease incidences in more than 160 slums in both Rajshahi City Corporation area and also Khulna City Corporation area. The idea is to collect this data and observe these incidences in different seasons and also in different years, so that in last 3 years, based on their experiences, their observation, they can provide some policy decisions to the government. This is something happening in the slums and squatters, in these low-income communities, and you can take a policy decision to address these problems at the national level. So this is one thing, one project that is being implemented by Health Program of BRAC. And the second program example that I would like to share with you is the livelihood one, is ultra-poor graduation program, who is implementing another project on livelihood.
Rabbani, just to remind our audience that the ultra-poor graduation program of BRAC is one of BRAC's flagship programs. So this is this program which is implementing another climate-related program. That's what Rabbani is talking about. Carry on.
Yeah. So ultra-poor graduation program has their, time frame. Like they take 18 months in the urban areas to graduate from a poverty and a vulnerability level to some level when they are capable enough to continue their life and livelihoods. So what they do, they identify the ultra-poor woman, and is 100% beneficiaries are women. So in Khulna, for example, they identified approximately 300, bit more than 300 actually, about 300 women in these slums of Khulna City Corporation area. And they did the same in Rajshahi. Once they identify these 300 women from 300 households, they bring them under a training program and they ask them if they are interested to start an enterprise, a small-scale enterprise. And based on their interest, their capacity, and their experience, they can immediately start with a small shop, with tailoring business, with clothing business, whatever they like. And then they are trained up and they are monitored, they are capacitated. They also receive financial training so that they can manage their business, they can manage their profits. So these are the different things actually they train, including on the impact of climate change, how the climate change is currently impacting their life and livelihood, and what can happen in future, so that they are aware about the potential impact on their life, and also they are provided livelihoods. This is one of the very interesting projects that is being implemented by UPG party, focusing on livelihoods of the women.
Yeah, I want to understand a little bit more. The Ultra Poor project is already an existing program of BRAC, right? And it helps people graduate from poverty in a relatively defined time and is focused towards women. The climate change angle, is it only education? Is that the important thing that you're stressing? That how will their livelihoods be impacted by climate change? Is it education or is there anything more?
Something more. That's a very interesting question. In fact, I asked them this question, what is the difference between your earlier model and this current model that you are currently implementing? So the explanation is earlier, they used to just provide the training and to start the business. But now, for example, if some woman wants to start a small shop, small grocery, they will suggest them to install this small shop in a place which is not exposed to waterlogging, which can avoid the flood inundation, storm surge. So you cannot really establish this shop in a place under the risk of flood inundation, cyclonic inundation, or any other risk that may pose. So these are trying to actually provide the cash grant to any of their beneficiary. It's not only the education part, it is also that they are trying these climate change related aspects in support and the climate migrants beneficiaries.
Great. This is obviously a great example of a project BRAC is doing. If you can give us a few examples of projects that your other NGO partners are doing.
Okay, wonderful. Well, there are some other NGOs, very location-specific, local NGOs, they are implementing CBF-supported projects. I will just give you two examples. One, Eco-Social Development Organization, which is a Rajshahi-based organization. Let me just share you my experiences. In total, we are supporting 22 projects being implemented by both BRAC and non-BRAC NGOs. And if you look at the element or common sector of intervention, it is either wash or livelihoods. Wherever you go, our presence currently is in 26 districts. Under both the climate change and emergency response window, we see these two sectors of intervention. HDO is focusing on both of them. They are trying to install water points and also toilet so that both of these options can be used by the climate migrants and the vulnerable people all around the year, even during the disaster period. So how in every case they are actually raising the plinth of both the water point and also the toilet so that they can use it during the inundation period. If there is a flood, they can use it. If there is cyclone and storm surge, they can use it. So this is one example that SDO is doing, and also providing livelihood support. In some cases, they are providing the cash grant so that they can start their business, like I explained in the UPGP case. So in most of the NGOs, what I see, they are following more or less similar approach. They trained up the targeted beneficiaries and also the cash grant, and they also provide the training for managing this business to utilize the profit in the business and also their regular expenditure. So this is how SDO is implementing. And if we bring another example from Khulna and from southern part, another NGO that we see is DSK. Dusto Shastro Kendra. They are also doing the same approach in the same sector of intervention, which is water supply and sanitation, and also livelihoods. So these are the examples that I can share with you at this moment.
Yeah, one thing that is I'm finding puzzling is that the intervention by these NGOs, not the two projects that you described of BRAC, by these NGOs, are they targeted to the people in the areas of where they're vulnerable, that is near the coast or near the river or in the rural areas, or are they targeting people who are moving to the cities? So are they sort of rural-centric projects, if you may, or are they urban-centric projects?
That's a very big difference. If the project is under climate change window, it must be city-based. And if it is under emergency response window, it could be in the city or it could be in the rural areas. So that is open.
So the projects of the NGOs under the climate change window is to increase the resilience of people who are migrating to these cities? Because we know that when people migrate to the cities, they're staying in informal settlements, they're staying in peri-urban areas, and they do not have access to jobs and occupations in the city. They have to buy food. Earlier, they were maybe growing food. So the target is, if I'm hearing you correctly, is to increase the resilience of these people who have already migrated. Is that correct?
Partially correct, of course. I mean, there are two types of people. Our primary target is the people that you just mentioned, the climate migrants, but we also consider, the people who are at the risk of being displaced from this destination to other destination. So there are some people we see, for example, in slums of Khulna, in this region, they are also exposed to different type of hazards. So cyclone and storm surge. If they are very close to the river, they are also in fear of displacement. So we are also supporting them.
Right. Before we move on to some lessons in the last part of the podcast, let me just reflect back on a few things I've heard, because what you have said has so much intensity to it that I think we need to spend a little time. You are focusing on people who are moving to the urban areas and increasing their resilience. But we must understand that people who move to urban areas, it is not that they have an immediate opportunity for a better life. They are exposed to different types of vulnerability, especially because they live in peri-urban and informal settlements. They are exposed to high heat temperatures, heat islands in these cities. They're exposed to health issues, and they're exposed, of course, to flooding, both river flooding, if these settlements are near rivers, or urban flooding. And then they might have to move again. What I think you're trying to do, you've not said it, but I'm going to say this, is to stop this, what could be an endless cycle of people moving from one part of another as climate change sets in with greater intensity. The projects that you have described for that BRAC is doing on the livelihood area, and the other one is, of course, in the health area, to me seems like bigger systemic changes in that the country can adopt in relationship to livelihood, in relationship to health. And the projects that you are describing that the local NGOs are doing are more focused, specific, geographically targeted areas. Is this the kind of picture that I'm taking away from what you are describing? And I'll jump straight on to ask you a few lessons. Obviously, one unique thing, not in the BRAC implementing projects, but the one unique thing is the ability to fund local NGOs. And these are small NGOs, the ones that you mentioned. Is there a capacity and ability to absorb climate funds? I know they have been doing donor-funded projects for a long time, but is there ability to implement climate projects in these organizations?
Well, that's an excellent question. In fact, when we start the evaluation of the project, we find some gaps in terms of consequences of the climate change, the current adaptation option, their proposed adaptations. It's very often that we see the linkages between the proposed actions and the reduction of the vulnerability is missing in many cases. What we currently do, we invite the project manager and also project key persons to a series of sessions and explain them the climate change impact, vulnerabilities, consequences, and how their proposed action can really reduce the climate vulnerabilities in different contexts, in terms of wash, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of solid waste management, in terms of better housing, in terms of raised walkways. So different type of infrastructural support, how this reduce the vulnerability of the climate change. So to respond to your question directly, yes, they have capacity gap. And to elaborate further, yes, we also have scope to build their capacity and improve their capacity to design the project efficiently and plan their project and implement their project efficiently. So this process, we actually start from the very beginning.
And what about sustainability? I mean, the 11 million KfW fund won't last for more than a few years. How do these organizations build on and get more projects?
Okay, that's an interesting point. In climate change negotiation process, there was one of the major argument every time I attended these climate COPs, almost every year, that the climate financing should be predictable. And fortunately, this is very innovative approach. I would stand for it because, as I mentioned, that 11.9375 million euro that we received from both BRAC and also from the German government, majority of it in the approximately 10 million, we invested in government treasury bond. And we are utilizing the income of this investment to support project every year, which means the capital amount remains untouched every year. Okay, so this is a mechanism that actually ensure sustainability of the financing mechanism, because we are not touching on the capital amount, and this is not a one-go type of project that you see everywhere in the world. In most of the cases, that's how the modality is really suitable for long-term adaptation options, because adaptation is not a short-term issue. It is a long-term issue. Climate change is something that will not happen for just next 10 years. Our projection, our observation, and if you consider a sixth assessment IPCC report, they are projecting for 2050, 21st century. So it's a 100 years issue.
It is actually very interesting that you are investing in these projects through the interest earned from the corpus, which also means, I suppose, that these projects are not necessarily very capital intensive. Obviously, from all that you have heard, they're extremely impactful. But am I correct in understanding that they're not very capital intensive? Tell us a little bit about how much is the average project value?
That's a wonderful question. We have a range. The project should be between 50 lakhs BDT to 3 crore BDT, which is around $50,000 to $300,000 approximately. But in most of the cases, it remains like 200 to 300,000 euros in our last few years' experiences. And in terms of duration, it is 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I really want our audience to take this away. Project sizes of $200,000 to $300,000, euros, whatever you call it, implemented over a 3 to 5 year period can create significant impact. That's really the lesson from the Climate Bridge Fund. And this is not the type of project that can be funded by the Adaptation Fund or the Green Climate Fund. They have to be funded through local organizations who know the lay of the land. Rabbani, the last question for you. You'll be going to COP this year. You went to COP last year. And when you stand up there and speak, what lessons do you think your project will have for Africa or the small island developing states?
Well, there are few lessons that I can share at this moment. The first thing is, as I was just mentioning, in many cases, what we see, the proponents do not really consider the climate projections of the project locations. They often talk about the past experiences and also the current experiences. But when you talk about the adaptation, it is in the slightly different from the development projects. In development projects, in most of the cases, they consider about the 5 to 10 years maximum. But when you talk about adaptation, it must come. To avoid the consequences of cyclone and storm surge, you have to see the projection of cyclone and storm surge, rise, silent intrusion, whatever the technology, whatever the prescribing. So in one sentence, integration of climate change, climate projection is extremely important when you design an adaptation project. That's number one. Number two is, if you want to really establish this type of innovative financing mechanism, you need to consider the consequences of the financial policy of the government. I just give you one example. When this Climate Bridge Fund was designed in 2015, it took almost 4 years to officially start the journey. At the time, the project was designed considering that the 10% of the income will have to be paid as tax. But it is unfortunate that we are paying 25% as tax. So it's 50% increase. In this case, this is what the challenge that we are facing. So how do you overcome this challenge? You can definitely overcome these challenges if you have more investment and more contribution from other development partners or from the same development partners. We invested 10 million and we are paying approximately 25% of the income every year, which is a big challenge. So these two things that I can share you right now.
This is wonderful. Rabbani, we have come to the end of the podcast. And if people have to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
All right. I can be reached through rabbani.golam@brac.net, also through our web link, which is www.brac.net/CBF.
Lovely. And we would have these details in our show notes as well. And with that, thank you very much, Rabbani.
Thank you so much, Sanjay.